Before it released, The Day Before was a much anticipated zombie survival MMO whose trailers got people very hyped to play the game. So hyped, in fact, that prior to release it was the most wishlisted game on Steam for quite a while. You may notice that this game on screen is not The Day Before. I can't actually play The Day Before because currently it is delisted from Steam. The publisher is offering open, no questions asked refunds, and the studio has either declared bankruptcy or quietly changed their name, but that seems to kind of just be some colossally poor timing for an unrelated developer. Hi, I'm Graham. Normally here on YouTube I play RuneScape, but I also love talking about and designing games. And honestly, I think that The Day Before has a lot worth talking about. Not so much the product itself. I mean, you heard what's happened in the just matter of days since the game's release. But what the game represents and could be, I think, is something that is worth talking about. Now, what did we actually get with The Day Before? They had promised originally a big, open, zombie survival MMO where you'd get to run around with all your friends and do the typical DayZ type stuff that people seem to love to no end. What we actually got was a glitchy mess, a barely functional game with few zombies and horrible servers. It also wasn't an MMO at all. It actually turned out to be an extraction shooter, which is not at all what any of the marketing in the lead up to it had said. Of course, as you would imagine, it rapidly plummeted to the bottom of Steam's top 10 worst reviewed games of all time. I saw one comment that could not find in the almost 22,000 reviews that have been left on the game, where somebody described it as a bad Tarkov with zombies. I also found this one that declared that the game had been dropped on its head fatally. Oof, that is just savage. But they're also kinda right. Like, this is just not at all what the devs told us that we were going to get, and rightfully they've gotten the blowback for that. But what could it have been? On the whole, the idea of a zombie extraction shooter, kind of like things like Escape from Tarkov, is really not a terrible idea. Zombie survival is just a very natural fit for the genre in my mind. You know, it's a survival situation. Normally these things are based around, like, a lot of post-Chernobyl type situations, so, setting it in a different kind of apocalyptic scenario rather than a nuclear one makes sense to me. And honestly, it's a great opportunity to make a solid co-op or single-player game. For example, the game that you've been watching, Zero Sievert, is a phenomenal little project that really opened my eyes to what an extraction shooter could be. Like, Tarkov and them never clicked with me, but this one I really like. Still pretty fresh into it, but it's been a ton of fun so far. And that all got me thinking about what a hypothetical good version of what we actually got from The Day Before would look like. So, obviously, this is with the caveat that you have to just completely gut the entire MMO angle. Obviously, that tag should have never been anywhere near the project they were actually working on. So, setting all of that aside, what kind of game would we be left with? Well, in an interview with One Up magazine, Michael Booth, one of the people who was behind the original Left 4 Dead, talked about how when they had first made it, they started with a large city map that the players would be dropped into. And the problem that they ran into is that players would memorize one route through the city and always take that exact same route. Of course, while that wasn't good for what Left 4 Dead was going for, where you start from at one point and have to get to a different point and escape, it's kind of perfect for an extraction shooter. So what I'm imagining is something kind of similar to Left 4 Dead. Not so much gameplay-wise, but setup-wise, where either as a single player or as a group, like a cooperative group, players would start out from a base, go out into a zombie-infested city, and do the typical extraction shooter stuff. Giving people the chance to play with their friends is great because games are always more fun with friends, and who doesn't want to do that? But also making sure that the solo players can do their own thing is very important in a game like this. Now, you don't want to make it too easy. I think the enemies in the game would have to be on the harder side, just to encourage people to stay together and work together and try to foster those beautiful moments when you're on a solo run and somebody comes and helps you out. I do think that a game like this would be best served by not having open PvP, but we'll come back to that later. Of course, whenever you mention Left 4 Dead, one of the things that people always wonder about are the special infected, and I feel like in these kind of games, this isn't a horde shooter like Left 4 Dead or Vermintide. It's an extraction shooter. I don't think having enemies whose explicit design purpose is to force cooperation would be good, especially if we want to make sure that the game is solo viable. That being said, having different types of zombies with some varied abilities could go a long way towards keeping the combat from becoming too samey. You'd also want to make sure that there are lots of different ways through the city. In this case, I think a game world where it's maybe a smaller city. I believe the day before used a kind of a stand-in for Manhattan. Having a smaller city where you can go into every building would I think, work a lot better than one where you're constantly just stuck out on the streets most of the time. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about being able to go into every skyscraper in a city, because anyone who's worked in one of those high-rise offices can tell you they're very boring on the inside, usually. But what I mean more is, years ago, I remember being in Kansas City, and on the outskirts of the city, there are a lot of buildings, at least the part that I was in, where everything is connected by walkways over the street. And that would just be really cool for a game like this, where you could go into one building and loot it, but maybe outside is way too dangerous for you to want to tangle with, so you decide to just clear out the walkway and head over to the next building and maybe find a different way out there. Something that you could do is break the city into sections, so you could have maybe one section that's kind of to ease players into the game loop, and other sections that are aimed towards being harder to provide more challenge as they get used to playing the game. This is also where I imagine PvP coming back in, because obviously you want to reward people who engage with that kind of content. So I'm imagining some sort of high-risk, high-reward open PvP zone, kind of like what I believe The Division 2 had, so that players who choose to engage with the more dangerous content do get rewarded for it, but the players who don't want to touch it at all don't have to. For that exact same reason, I feel like it would be really important to make sure that those PvP zones and their perhaps better loot, better gear, rarer materials really should not be incorporated into the critical path itself. I think it would be something better for either risky players who want to just try to get a massive jump start, or people who are in the end game and want to take on the hardest challenge they can, which is always going to be other people. And of course, going back to that interview, one of the things specifically with the big city map that the Left 4 Dead team ran into is that they would have players get really confused at first, which really isn't a fun place to be unless you're specifically in very certain kinds of horror. So this would be a great opportunity to allow, when you set out on a mission, ideally either solo or with your friends, give them a pre-planning screen so that you can kind of chart out the vague course that you want to go through to get where you're trying to go. I just think that would be helpful to make sure everybody stays on track. It would allow more experienced players to help less experienced players by showing them the good routes. so that when they're first getting started, they're not just being thrown to the proverbial wolves. And of course, I'm always a fan of story in games, personally. I think that that's an often overlooked and underutilized section of most games. So I would want some sort of kind of mission-based story that the players can work through. Maybe a series of increasingly challenging missions where you have to go out into the city and gather certain, like construction materials, or maybe mark something for another team to extract later that maybe one person or a group, even a small group of people, couldn't move on their own. You could have spin-offs of that where you have to get to a point and defend one of those extraction teams. The important thing with that would be for those larger missions to actually physically change how the base looks for the player. I think one of the coolest things that a game like this would be able to do, and I don't think really has been done in a game like this yet, is to let the players' successes in-game reflect in what they're seeing most of the time. So, as you go through, maybe the base starts out really run down, very bare bones, and things get more and more comfortable as you carve out your little slice of the apocalypse for the survivors in your camp. However, obviously every mission can't be this kind of big, go out and find us a pickup truck or something. So it'd be important to have repeatable kind of supply missions where they're going out and getting, maybe more medical supplies, more ammunition, scrap, stuff like that. Basically, how I would imagine this going is that if you're not feeling like following the critical path, then you can just go out into the city and run around and grab things that are still going to be useful for you, but won't have the same time or perhaps even difficulty commitment as one of the bigger missions. Anyway, that's just a very kind of a bare bones idea that all of this really got me started thinking about, because it's always terrible when a game fails to live up to its potential. And again, honestly, this game wasn't even something that was on my radar until all of this blew up, and then I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since, because I want that game that... I don't care so much about the MMO part. Honestly, DayZ was never my thing. I tried it twice, didn't enjoy it. But the best version of what they offered, actually gave us, I think, could be a really cool game. And obviously, if they're told up front what it actually is and not fed actual lies about the kind of genre, I think there are a lot of people out there who would enjoy the game and have a great time with it. Anyway, those are just my thoughts, more or less, on the whole thing. So, let me know what you think down in the comments. Does that seem like a game you'd enjoy too? Do you have other ideas? Am I way off base on this one? Go ahead and let me know. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.